My name is Javier. I used to be a reasonably clean accountant in a city where most money is dirty. I handled ledgers for construction firms, the kind of legitimate businesses that acted as perfect shields for illicit cash flow. But eventually I was told I'd be handling a new client, a shell corporation named La Sombra, the Shadow. Everyone knew what La Sombra was. Whispers in the financial district described them as less a business and more a mathematical entity, a black hole of capital. I took the job because the money was more than I could ever refuse. A specific, escalating amount transferred every month, a silent contract signed only in greenbacks. The psychological dread began the moment I saw the first zero on the bank statement. It was too perfect, too vast. The boss, a man only referred to as El Jefe, never met me in person. All communication was through a burner phone dropped off in a sealed heavy box and a single leather-bound ledger. The tactile texture of that ledger was slick and cold, like cured skin stretched over dry wood. It was impossibly old, not vintage, but ancient, and smelled faintly of burnt coffee, ozone, and something metallic, like old pennies. My instructions were precise. Keep the numbers clean, move the phantom funds through the construction shells, and never ask why a single transaction of $43,711.05 repeated exactly every 11th of the month. It was an anomaly, a wound in the numbers I was told to ignore. I worked from my home office, a converted concrete bunker I rented specifically for the security and the soundproofing. The first month was easy, a dull exercise in digital sleight of hand. The second, I found a discrepancy. An additional unsolicited deposit of $100,000 into one of the shell accounts. It was a clear overpayment. I was supposed to report every anomaly, every deviation from the written protocol. I hesitated for 3 days. It felt like a test, a deliberate pressure point. If I reported it, I'd be viewed as a threat to their flexibility, someone who couldn't be trusted with autonomy. If I kept it quiet, I'd be complicit not just in fraud, but in defiance of the master rules. I chose silence, justifying it as maintaining operational flow. This personal guilt or moral failure was the true cause of my horror the moment I signed my soul over to the numbers. By month 3, the numbers began to speak, not with words, but with an appalling internal consistency. I was moving millions. But the totals? The total expenditures every week? The collective quarterly earnings across 6 different shell companies always converged on an exact, repeating sequence of digits: 4371105. The amount from the 11th of the month was now woven into everything. It was the atomic structure of the entire financial architecture. My rational mind screamed that this was a coincidence of vast, complex, and high-volume transactions, a fluke of Benford's Law. My internal voice whispered that it was a signature. The sound in my office changed. It wasn't the sound of the city. The soundproofing was too good. It was a rhythmic, almost subsonic thump, thump, thump that I could only hear when I stared at the repeating numbers on the screen. It was a bass note below the register of human hearing, felt more through the floorboards than the eardrums. I would press my ear against the polished mahogany of my desk, trying to locate the source, but it seemed to emanate from the walls, the furniture, or worse, my own temples, a relentless pulse. It was an environmental echo of the calculation itself, a beat that kept precise time with the mounting debt in the ledger. My hands started shaking so violently I had to switch to voice dictation for memos. I drank coffee all day just to steady them, the caffeine useless against the supernatural unease. I began seeing the sequence everywhere, a pattern or number sequence that shouldn't exist. The odometer in my car, the time on my microwave, the number of steps it took from my bed to the coffee maker. 4371105. The light from my screen became a hostile glare, reflecting those 7 digits into my eyes, burning the image into my retina. The fear wasn't of prison or discovery. It was of becoming mathematically irrelevant, of being subsumed by the cold, eternal logic of the ledger. 6 months in, the pressure was intolerable. I was rich, exhausted, and terrified. I decided to quit. I was rich enough to disappear. I prepared to close the books, methodically scrubbing every line I could justify as an error or an adjustment. But the ledger resisted my withdrawal. When I attempted to finally zero out the monthly payment for the 11th, to remove the core anomaly, the leather's tactile sensation changed. The book resting beside my keyboard became intensely hot, almost burning my fingertips, radiating heat like a coil. I jumped back, startled. The number simply reappeared on the screen, bold, red, and unwavering. I tried again, hitting delete, until the key felt spongy and my monitor flashed blindingly before going completely dark, leaving the room in oppressive silence. When the screen returned, after a terrifying minute of darkness, there was a new entry. It wasn't on the digital spreadsheet. It was written in a strange, looping, impossible cursive that was not my handwriting, but appeared on the final, previously blank page of the old leather ledger itself. I didn't need to touch the book to read it. The entry was dated today's date. It read, "Final calculation due. Javier B. Price. $43,711.05. I felt the immense, cold presence of El Jefe, even though he was miles away, perhaps centuries away. He wasn't tracking money. He was tracking a deep, personal debt. The ledger was a contract, and the repeating sequence wasn't a transaction. It was my price tag. The exact, mathematically perfect cost of my soul, dictated by my one small act of moral failure. The book had just written my name into the final line item. I have to, because I know if I ever try to zero out my own balance again, the final debt will be paid in my absence, and I don't know what they take in lieu of dollars. My involvement was small, stupid, and utterly based on desperation. I was 22, had medical bills, and agreed to drive a shipment of electronics across a specific, poorly guarded stretch of desert border. I told myself it was just contraband. The fear of the drug lord horror was a distant, journalistic abstraction. The pickup was a small, corrugated steel warehouse in the middle of nowhere, smelling strongly of dust and diesel fumes. The drug lord, a silent, imposing man I'll call the patron, was nowhere in sight. Only his 2 lieutenants, one silent and tattooed, one too jovial, and constantly chewing gum. They didn't pay me in cash. They paid me with a burner phone and a heavy-duty USB stick. The only instruction: watch this before you cross. You need to know the route exactly. The USB stick held a single video file named Passage MP4. I played it on my cheap, overheating laptop in the cab of my borrowed pickup. The desert light was fading, giving the small screen a sickly blue cast. The video was shot from the exact perspective of my dashboard. It was my truck, a dented the 1980s Ford, and my side of the border. But the footage was old, grainy, saturated with the specific heat haze of the desert, and clearly filmed years ago. It showed the truck driving the specific dirt track route I was supposed to take. The intense psychological dread began when I realized the driver in the video was me. Not a look-alike, but me, wearing the same tired denim jacket, fiddling with the radio the same specific way I had a minute earlier. The face was obscured by the blinding glare of the setting sun, but the mannerisms were mine, precise and intimate. This wasn't a warning. This was memory distortion, or false perception being used as a training tool. They weren't just showing me the route, they were showing me my past. The video contained no dialogue, only an environmental echo. The constant, low-frequency hum of the engine and the rhythmic clack-clack of the old truck's bad shocks hitting the uneven dirt road. The sound was pervasive and started to infect my actual hearing. I would pause the video, and the clack-clack would continue outside the truck, perfectly synced with the movement of my real wheels. The world had become a soundtrack to a pre-recorded event. I started driving. I placed the laptop on the passenger seat, playing the video on a small loop, trying to synchronize my actual journey with the recorded one. I was desperately trying to find the point where the footage diverged from reality, the moment I could reclaim my free will. The sun was setting, casting long, sickly orange light across the desert scrub, mirroring the light in the video exactly. I gripped the tactile texture of the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white, my hands slick with fear and sweat. The patron's lieutenants hadn't given me a map or verbal directions. They had given me a self-fulfilling prophecy, a chronological script. Every landmark I saw, a dead saguaro, a specific rock formation, a rusted oil drum, appeared in the video 3 seconds before I passed it in reality. I wasn't following a map. I was following a timeline. The terror was the feeling that I had no free will. I was simply reenacting a crime that had already been recorded, and the cargo wasn't the objective. The completed video was. Near the final checkpoint, where the dirt road met the main highway, the video reached its dreadful climax. The camera shifted slightly. The driver, who was me, turned his head sharply toward the passenger seat, looking directly where my laptop was now sitting. The driver in the video reached out, slowly, and picked up a briefcase from the seat. It was a dark, metal briefcase I didn't have, and I knew instantly it contained the real product, the reason for the trip. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching on the loose gravel, dust kicking up violently around the truck. I stared at the screen, heart hammering. The driver in the video opened the briefcase. Inside was nothing but sand and a single dried rose, which the driver placed carefully on the dashboard. Then, the driver looked directly at the camera, at me, and smiled. A slow, terrible, human betrayal, stalking, or manipulation that used my own face to deliver the final blow. The smile was not mine. It was the patron's, worn over my features. I looked down, shaking so hard my teeth chattered. On my passenger seat, beside my laptop, was a briefcase I had never seen, metal and cold to the touch, smelling faintly of old roses and desert dust. It had appeared silently, pulled from the past or projected from the future. The patron didn't need me for transport. He needed me for a reenactment, a specific, chronological anchor to use my terror and my body to plant or retrieve something years later. The horror was the realization that I wasn't driving a truck. I was an actor in someone else's carefully scripted, time-delayed haunting. I drove the rest of the way with the briefcase heavy on the seat, knowing I had just used my own life to close a loop that someone else, wearing my skin, had started years ago. Which is scarier? A debt that must be paid in money, or a debt that must be paid in time? My name is Elena. I made the mistake of trying to leave the organization. They didn't kill me. They didn't maim me. They did something much worse, something subtle and deeply personal, designed to destroy me from the inside out. They relocated me to a property deep in the high plains, a brutalist, concrete compound surrounded by empty scrubland. My new job was simple, a sentence masquerading as a salary. Monitor the environmental echo of their operations, a hidden high-frequency sound emitter buried beneath the central facility. They called it the sanity check. The rule, drilled into me by a perpetually nervous lieutenant, was that the emitter must never be silenced. The facility was rigged with industrial fans, massive generators, and white noise machines, creating a perpetual, deafening sonic blanket. The constant low roar of machinery wasn't just loud, it was a physical presence. A warm, vibrating, tactile texture in the air that pressed against my skin and skull. This was the consequence of my personal guilt or moral failure for trying to betray them. My sentence was a lifetime spent guarding the noise, which was, in turn, guarding me from something else. I carried a small, cold sound meter everywhere. The lieutenant told me that if the sound ever dropped below a specific decibel level, a preset minimum, the facility would be considered compromised, and the silent protocol would commence. I didn't know what that meant, but his wide, panicked eyes were enough. He described the silence not as an absence of sound, but as an absence of safety. My emotional arc was a steady descent from rational protection to a paranoid obsession with the noise, believing it was the only thing keeping me alive. It happened during the night shift. I was monitoring the main generator through the one pane of thick, scratched glass in my control room, illuminated by the harsh, unrelenting yellow overhead light. 1 second the air was vibrating a warm, constant pressure against my eardrums. The next second, it was gone. Not a power failure. I checked the visual readouts instantly. The generator lights were still blazing green. The fan blades were still turning, a blur of motion. But there was no sound. The change wasn't quiet. It was an impossible, complete absence that felt like a pressure vacuum being formed around my skull. The silence wasn't restful. It was a physical threat. A sudden, cold terror that made the inside of my ears ring violently with phantom sound. I looked at the sound meter. It read 120 decibels. The system was reporting maximum output, but my own ears registered absolute, chilling 0. This was malfunctioning or haunted technology designed not just to mask, but to impose reality. The silence was only for me. A personalized sonic hell. I felt the immense dread of isolation. The world was moving, but I was severed from it. I tried to call out, to verify my condition. But my own voice made no sound. I opened my mouth. I felt the air rush over my tongue and throat, but I was utterly deaf to myself. I was alone, trapped inside a bubble of forced silence, while the machines around me roared with inaudible rage. I grabbed a steel clipboard, the cold tactile feel jarring, and slammed it against the console. The impact was felt as a dull, dead vibration in my hand, but I heard nothing, only the phantom ringing. Then, I saw the reflection in the dark glass of the monitor. It was a man, standing directly behind me, in the center of the control room. He was a silent, imposing figure, too dark for the yellow light. A physical shadow. He hadn't broken into the facility. He was simply revealed by the impossible silence. He was part of the silent protocol. He wasn't moving toward me. He was standing perfectly still, holding something small and metallic. He raised it slowly and gently placed it in the center of the room. It was an old, cheap microphone on a stand. I felt a paralyzing psychological dread as I understood the ultimate human betrayal, stalking, or manipulation. The noise wasn't a mask for the outside world. It was a noise machine for him, set at a specific frequency to prevent any other sound from being recorded. The noise kept the recorder honest. The silence had simply activated his recording equipment. He was here to capture what happens when a person's reality breaks. My screams, my pleas, my final thoughts, all preserved in absolute fidelity, in a way the patron could listen to later, at his leisure. The noise came back an hour later, a painful physical rush that felt like my skull cracking. But I still can't hear my own whispers, knowing someone else has the tape of my breakdown. My name is Marco. My job for the cartel was strictly transportation, specifically moving high-value assets into a heavily fortified location I only knew as the Vault. The Vault was deep beneath an abandoned meatpacking plant, the kind of place where the permanent, sickly smell of bleach, stale fat, and old metal hung in the air, a physical weight that pressed on the chest. The final, horrifying part of the job was always the same: waiting in the safe room for the security sweep to finish, a process that could take hours. The safe room was built to withstand anything. A perfect cube of polished steel, airtight, soundproof, and designed to nullify electromagnetic pulses. My final asset was a small, lead-lined briefcase, suspiciously cold to the touch. I placed it on the steel bench and leaned against the cold, tactile texture of the wall. The massive door hissed shut, its pneumatic seal locking me in. My emotional arc was one of denial transforming into terrifying truth. I kept repeating to myself, "This is just a job. I am not one of them. I will walk away." I noticed the first impossibility after about an hour of watching the white overhead light reflect off the pristine steel. The emergency clock on the wall was running backward, not counting down from a preset time, but literally decrementing the actual time of day. 1 o'clock in the morning went to 12:59 a.m., then 12:58 a.m. I tapped the heavy steel wall, my heart beginning to hammer a frantic sound against the silence. This room was a place that resists being left, not through physical locks, but through chronological distortion. It was stealing time from the inside out. I pulled out my own cheap digital watch. It was still running forward. The room's clock was definitely reversing. The psychological dread became visceral, a cold panic that felt like freezing water being poured into my stomach. I started talking to myself, recording voice notes on my phone to establish an external timeline, terrified of memory distortion or being driven mad. I spoke for 40 minutes, detailing the temperature, the lights, the horrifying clock. When I played the note back, it was only 20 seconds long, ending abruptly mid-sentence with a choked, guttural sound that I didn't recognize as my own, followed by silence. The room was not only reversing time, it was compressing it. I looked at the briefcase, suddenly feeling a surge of supernatural unease. The cartel wasn't moving assets. They were moving something resistant to time, something that caused temporal drag. The room was a temporal sink, built to stabilize or store whatever was in that lead-lined case. My panic became a cold, paralyzing certainty. The longer I stayed, the more time the room would steal from me, and the greater the difference between my internal chronology and the external world. I was becoming an anchor. I decided to try the emergency release, violating my one rule to never touch the controls. The heavy red button was located under a protective grate. I slammed my hand onto it. Nothing. Then, the room's light system began to fail. It didn't flicker. It turned from a clean white to a sickening ancient amber, like the light filtered through old, dried blood, making the polished steel look perpetually wet. The air was getting thick, and the smell of old metal and ozone intensified, mixed with a faint, sweet decay. I looked back at the steel bench where I had placed the briefcase. It was gone. In its place was a stack of old, brittle, dust-covered invoices dated 3 decades ago. They were invoices for meat preservation services, signed by a name I didn't recognize. I realized that the briefcase hadn't vanished. The room had simply snapped back to a previous chronological state, and the asset it held had been replaced by its former contents. The cartel knew the room was faulty. They used me as the temporal anchor, locking me in with the asset to ensure the transfer occurred at a specific point in time relative to my physical presence. My final moral dilemma was staring at me. If I left, the room would eventually snap back to the present, and whatever object it now held would be dragged forward with a 3-decade price tag, perhaps contaminating the present with something terrible. I heard the hiss of the outer door. The security sweep was done. I could leave. But as I grabbed the handle, I looked at the steel bench one last time. The dusty invoices were gone. In their place, etched deeply into the polished steel, was a single, fresh, handwritten word: stay. It was a desperate, final warning from a fellow victim. A plea for the anchor to remain, lest the past come forward. I didn't leave because I realized the vault doesn't resist being left. It resists losing what it has already taken, and I was all that remained. Would you choose deafening noise forever if the alternative was absolute, revealing silence? This is Dread Dynasty, where nightmares come to life. Thank you for watching tonight's stories. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because the next nightmare is closer than you think. Check the channel for more interesting nightmare.